And we reached module 2 of psychology of consciousness. Thank you very much for being here for the second week of this course. Today we will continue the discussion we began last week, and we will delve a little more into the philosophy, the anthropology, the sociology, and the neurology of consciousness. So this is a very complex topic, and I hope I will do my best to deliver only the most important information, which will then be used to corroborate a claim which we'll make in week 3, week 4, and week 5. So the first question that people often ask about consciousness is, how do we know that we are conscious? Now, this might be, to some extent, a very silly question, because the very fact that we are able to make that claim or to ask that question should be enough evidence that we are indeed, to some level, conscious. And yet, this also bears another question. Is consciousness something that should be viewed in a binary system or more of a spectrum-based system? So this is the first thing that we'd like to discuss here. Are we talking about a binary, okay? A binary system, binary, and as the name implies, binary, okay, means 1 or 2, or even better in mathematical terms, 1 or 0. If you are familiar with the computational neuroscience or simply with computer science, things such as 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, etc., etc. Those all represent a binary system. The example I made last week was whether consciousness could be viewed either as present, 1, or absent, 0. So in other words, to say that you are conscious is to some extent saying the same as, are you alive? Either you are alive or you're not alive. Now, in theoretical mathematics and philosophy, there is a distinction to be made between being alive and being not alive, but even more important, a distinction between not alive or dead. We will see now how that applies. So this will be option 1, whether consciousness can be viewed as a binary system or more of a spectrum, a gradient. Can we say that a person is more or less conscious? So that instead of saying 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, we could say 0 in parentheses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. on a scale, maybe a Likert scale, okay? Whether this would also contemplate 1.5, etc., remains to be seen, but in any case, it's a gradient, okay? So just like a light switch can be modulated as opposed to be turned on or off. Now, the question will remain in this context, because if consciousness is indeed a gradient, then it remains to be seen at which point we have a cutoff or a threshold. So could we say that halfway on a scale of 1 to 10, number 5 represents something according to which we should be considered fully conscious or not? Can someone enter consciousness and then leave consciousness? Or once you're inside a conscious state, there's something that happens that distinguishes the state of affair from being previously outside of the spectrum. So those are all theoretical questions, but from the perspective of psychology and neuroscience, we can start from the very basic of how do we know what we know, which is the same question we asked last week. So is consciousness something that can be monitored? So let's begin with this type of analysis. In the scientific method, if you remember from last week, there are multiple ways to understand what something is. So one of our duties in this course is to observe. We observe whether something is there. So there's always an empirical element, if you remember, okay, something that is, for lack of better term, perceived, okay, perceived with, I would say a good start would be our senses, okay, or with added features, okay? features. And these will include, of course, technology, okay? Knowledge, okay? Because, of course, nobody's silly enough to believe that everything our senses perceive is, in definition, accurate. So, for instance, think about a microscope. We're not able to see what a microscope sees, okay? Or the opposite, a macroscope, a telescope. So, our senses introduce something that's out there to be verified, okay? So, the first thing we do is to observe, all right? Now, once you have an observation, you need to put this observation to a data system or data set, and we will not discuss the mathematics here. And this usually means a second level of observation, okay? Second level observation, which in other words is statistical analysis. Statistical analysis. Okay? So you observe something, you accumulate this data set, you put everything together, and then you start to organize it in something that is visible, okay, and can be replicated. Okay? So from this, if you're a good scientist, hopefully you are able to perform a replication process. Okay? So you replicate what you observe. And if you observe the same phenomena, then you could claim that what you observe with your senses and other technological features, computer, etc., is indeed true, okay, true according to the scientific method. Now, replication could also mean over time, right? If you remember the discussion on the scientific method. So replication over time also involves meta-analysis, okay, meta-analysis, and the dear old randomized controlled trial, okay, double blind, hopefully, okay, randomized clinical trial, case control. All right, with the meta-analysis, of course, the thing happened over time, and I would say also across system, because your system has to be consistent. We'll discuss what that means. But aside from all these aspects here, when we talk about consciousness, we need to talk about something that we can relate to. So let's simplify all this, and this is not everything, and assume that we can just live with observation. All right, so let's start with this term, okay? Now, keep in mind that our perspective is very specific, is psychology of consciousness. So everything I will be discussing will be assessed according to this perspective. But as I mentioned multiple times, it is a good start to begin with the analysis of words, with the epistemological analysis, and with some neuroscience. So what you need to observe, we mean to say something that can be viewed, okay, viewed, okay, plus replicated, okay, replicated, right? One more thing. If you remember what I said last week, I mentioned something along the lines of absence of evidence and evidence of absence. So having enough scientific evidence simply means having enough view. Evidence, again, evidence from the Latin X plus vedere, okay? To see out of something, okay? So you extrapolate knowledge from what you can see, okay? I see, for instance, this object, this item, and I can extrapolate what this item is, for instance, made of, constructed as. I can even assume its purpose, or at the very least, the purpose as indicated by the way it was built. So we can assume that we know the purpose of the builder. What is this for? Now, how about neuroscience? How can neuroscience relate to consciousness? Well, let me show you something that is very useful. This is a little tool, little device I have right here that it's called the spiker box. What is a spiker box? as the name implies, a spiker box, it's a box, an electrical device that monitors spikes. Before I say anything, let's just see how it works. Well, I will not perform the whole experiment, but I will touch these little nails here with my fingers. I'll put it into two fingers, touch like that, and I will just turn it on right here. Okay? As you can see here, there's a battery, there's a relay, there's a mini amplifier here, mini booster, right? And of course, all the technological devices that allow for the transmission of the electric signal. So let's just turn it on and see what happens. What you can hear is the noise, the sound of the action potential. So what you can observe here, even if I don't interact with you, is the proof, so to speak, that I am indeed conscious according to, at the very least, computational and basic, I would say, neuroscience. Okay? Am I alive or not? You don't see anything. You see this video, assuming that this video is live, and I'm doing this, no proof, and then I'm doing this. You know that something in my body is happening. All right, so this spiker box is something that I used a few years ago. There was a wonderful class that Harvard down in Boston developed with EDX, backyard brains, to perform these very basic neuroscientific experiments that will monitor the action potential in a being. You could do that with insects, you can do this with animals, you can do that with us, of course, as I just demonstrated to you. And this is a very brief and very simple demonstration that anybody really could perform neuroscientific experiments, because the key is curiosity. The key to learn everything is being curious and observe the world. Now, of course, if you didn't know anything about neuroscience or psychology, noise will mean just noise, will not tell much to you. So I really encourage you to, if you are interested, browsing the Backyard Brains website, the ADX website, and even more so if you want to take some Harvard classes. I believe they still have the MOOC courses available. And it's a fascinating field. I really encourage you to do that perhaps at the end of the semester so you're not overwhelmed. But this is a very simple experiment with something that really fits into the palm of your hand. It's a very small spiker box and allows you to be amazed by what neuroscience has to tell us. So what are action potential? Let's start from that. Action potential really is the building block of the building block of neuroscience. So let's spend just a few seconds to see what that means. And let's see whether this is something that can be indeed viewed and replicated. So what do we mean by building blocks of the building blocks? Well, last time I mentioned the concept of what? A fractal, if you remember, right? Fractal. The fractal as this connection between microcosm and macrocosm, right? So with the world above, so to speak, okay, and the world below. So above, macro, okay, and below, micro, okay, micro. Okay? So in alchemy or esoteric knowledge, we would say, as above, so below, or what is above, so shall it be below. This is a quote that's been attributed to many alchemists, but if you really want to go back in time to the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, which is really hard to define as a historical figure because there are many claims that this figure is a mythological figure, as a divine being or a semi-divine being that brought knowledge to humanity, to some extent similar to what happened in other mythologies. Now, Hermes Trismegistus is the connection between the Greek or Greco-Roman mythology and the Persian Egyptian mythology. So to some extent, the bringer of light, the bringer of wisdom, okay? And then from the term Hermes, you have terms such hermetic knowledge, right? Hermetic knowledge, okay? Or anything that's hermetic as closed up, as hidden, so to speak, almost occult. And then Trismegistus, it's a readaptation of 3 times, so three times big, like magister, okay? Magister as big, okay? Magnum. So above as below, or so below as above. What's above shall be below, etc. Now, what do we mean by fractal knowledge in the context of what I just said? Well, we're talking about action potential. So the fractal is representation of something that can be viewed like this. Okay, let's assume that this is the minimum amount of knowledge. Okay, something like this, like a snowflake. All right, and this is the building block that could be attached. Okay, let's use red, to another building block. Okay, this, each of which is a re-representation of what? Of this. Of the same elements, okay? Etc. I don't have to do the whole thing, but you got the idea, okay? Etc. You can do it for everything. And then you continue. Now, for each smaller element, let's assume that this is a smaller element, you could do the same, okay? And you shall continue to demonstrate, so to speak, that this structure is representing itself ad infinitum or ad libitum, if we want to take a more anthropological perspective. So this sparkle, okay, this idea, this concept that keeps manifesting itself is what we're trying to discuss in the relation between action potential and consciousness. So imagine that this thing here, okay, or even better, these things here is our action potential. So let's delete everything else we don't need for now, all right? And transfer this right here, okay? So I'll magnify the shape, all right? Again, this is just a shape that I use as an example, okay? This shape replicates itself, and each time it replicates, we will put a check sign. It replicates once, twice, 3 times, etc., etc. Okay. Now, at this point, you start to notice a pattern. Okay, continue. Okay. Now, if you continue with the pattern, one thing is assumed here. The first thing is that the pattern follows a specific direction. Okay. Now, direction means direction in space and time. So, in our example, this direction goes from left, okay, to right, okay? Not only that, but in this example, because we're watching a video, this direction is on a plane space, okay, into a bidimensional space. Now, I will not venture into more esoteric philosophical discussion whether what you see there, right here, it's what I perceive here, because of course you're going to see this lecture not live. But it's also true the fact that whatever you're using to project this knowledge, it's something that is bidimensional. Okay? So it's on a screen, on a flat surface. So first, left to right on a flat surface. And also, you could say unipolar, unidirectional. So it only goes from A to B, all right? And not from B to A. So if this is true, okay, this is our hypothesis, let's see if our brain does the same thing. So if we want to assume that this is the building block, and this building block, check, 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 follows a rhythm, we could assume that this check, check, check could also be modulated in its speed. So let's try. Check, 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 again, check, 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 again, check, 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 check. And let's see if this mimics what's happening here. Ready? So this is the repetition, the sequence of action potentials. For each check, you do have the corresponding spike. Etc. And this is how we know that we are indeed conscious, at least from the perspective of neuroscience. Now, the spikes represent electrochemical transmission or electrochemical magnetic transmission in the brain. And so in order to understand what that means, we need to delve a little deeper into how our neuroscience defines consciousness. And this is what we will embark on for the first few weeks. So I have many courses where I teach basic neuroscience for the purpose of psychology, so I can direct you to those classes. So we can certainly do that, but just for the sake of simplification here, we will discuss how that works very basically. So the action potential represents an electric charge, an electric sparkle that the basic cell in the body, the neuron, replicates in order to reach the other neuron. So it's something that is very, very important because it allows us to relate to the microcosm inside of us, inside of our brain, and represent what occurs on the other side. If you can see here, the membrane potential goes from -70, -55, and then you have the time. I didn't really put anything down. So when the neurotransmitter interact with the receptor, this causes this repeated depolarization of the neuron, and the neuron will eventually reach the threshold membrane potential -55 in this scheme here, which is, you know, in a neuron membrane potential -70. This is generally the case around -55. Now, when the threshold is reached, the sodium channel open, a large number of them, and this will allow the charged sodium ions, the positive charged ions, to enter the cell. This causes massive depolarization of the neuron as the membrane potential reaches 0 and then becomes positive. Now, this is known as the rising phase, the peak, right? The rising phase of the action potential. This influx of positive ions, cations, creates this electrical signal, this action potential, which then travels down the neuron, Na+. You can see that. Eventually, this action potential will reach the peak, the sodium channels close, and the potassium channels open, K+, which allow this potassium to flow out of the cell. So the loss of positive potassium ions, K+, promotes repolarization, which is the falling phase of the action potential. Finally, the neuron returns to the resting membrane potential, the last curve, but eventually, so actually it overshoots and there's a hyperpolarization there. So during this phase, this refractory period, it's very difficult to cause the neuron to fire again, which is the very last part. Eventually, the potassium channel closes and the membrane returns to the resting membrane potential, and then you wait for the next action potential to be reactivated. Now, this, of course, is the basic of the signaling mechanism here. And the other thing that did not discuss, of course, is that there are some failed initiation also on the bottom right around the -70 phase. So this is, in short, what's happening in a schematic way about the action potential. All right, so this is a very simplified description of the action potential. But again, a few things you might notice here. First of all, we're talking about, yet again, an electric charge, okay, with depolarization and repolarization. Of course, with the resting states, it goes from -70 to -55. And you also see two things. The fact that we're talking about a chemical transmission here, okay, with sodium and potassium, and that's precisely we talk about the sodium-potassium pump. So when we think about the action potential as the unit that transmits awareness, consciousness, etc., we're talking about something that exists on a chemical, magnetic, and electric level, all right? So it's something that is discussed from the perspective of electrochemical, electromagnetic field, but also in terms of a mechanistic explanation. So all of this can be viewed as a process, as well as a mechanism. Okay? Mechanism. So this is connected to what we said earlier last week about how we viewed science, how we view knowledge. And we will refer to Aristotle multiple times in this semester because he does a really, really good job in understanding that. Now, the three terms that you might remember are knowledge as phronesis, knowledge as episteme, and knowledge as techne. So the technological element has to do with this mechanistic explanation. So all of this can be viewed into the transmission of action potential from one neuron to the next. So let's just leave these, okay? We'll simplify things here, okay? Okay. And this is what happens. Again, we talk about microcosm and microcosm, right? If this is our nervous system, okay? So at the level of the neuron, at the level of the neural transmission, so neurotransmission, at the level of neurotransmitter, at the level of the nervous system, and the level of the endocrine system, where the nervous system, of course, has to do with neurotransmitters, and the endocrine system has to do, of course, with hormones. Now, we will not discuss the action potential in depth when we are observing the stimulus and the sequence toward the next neuron, but at the very least, we should review a little bit how the nervous system actually works, and then we'll delve into more detailed explanation. So last time we discussed the brain a little bit, and today we will take a step backwards, so to speak, because the action potential is the thing that can be interpreted what's inside, but of course we need to see what's outside as well. All right, so we made this analogy between the action potential and this electric charge, which is an analogy that's entirely predicated in science. So if this were to be the system that I just drew in a smaller sense, we will have the cell body, which in our case, it's the neuron. So let's do this in a little bit of a descriptive manner. So this is the cell body of the neuron, okay, with all its dendrites, okay, dendrites. Here with the cell body. And let's label this neuron A. And we'll do the other neuron here. Organelles here. Okay. The dendrites. How cute they are. Call this neuron B. Then we need the axon, okay, not in scale, okay, we will leave some room here, okay, and this is where the action potential actually occurs, okay. So all these spikes represent transmission from neuron A to neuron B. So in a psychology of consciousness class, at the very least, before you embark on philosophical discussion on what consciousness is, at the very least, you can monitor these spikes. So whether I'm doing this, again, or if I'm calculating and observing the spikes, e.g., for instance, then I'm talking about the same thing. At the very least, before we embark on consideration on afterlife, gods, or soul, etc., we can observe something that exists. And without biological life, it ceases to exist. And that's precisely why it's so important to understand the difference between cardiothoracic or heart death, okay, cardiovascular heart death, and brain death, neurological death, okay? Because of course the heart will keep pumping for like 3.5 hours after biological death. So as far as the organ as the pump. So this action potential, really quick, could occur because if this is our axon, okay, the axon that allows for the neurotransmission, okay, this direction, okay, then the action potential occurs only because you have a depolarization, repolarization system that is stimulated by the change in charge due to the chemical changes in sodium and potassium. In the example prior to this, Na plus and K plus. So both cations, so electrically positively charged ions, cations. Okay. All right. So if this occurs, you need to have multiple things. You need to have an insulated property, the myelin sheet that wraps around your axon. Okay. Assume that this is all our insulation, just like as a cable, okay, in your computer. Okay. And this insulated property is the myelin, okay, myelin sheet, okay, okay, from the Greek word for honey. Okay. If your name is Melissa, for instance, that's also related to this same term. Or you can also look at it as a straw. Okay, so if you try to drink from a bottle with a straw, you want to make sure the straw is fully insulated, because otherwise the liquid you're drinking, the juice you're drinking, will be spilled all over the place. However, right here, okay, before the action potential can occur, you need to have this change in electric charge. And so the change in electric charge, if it can magnify a section, okay, of our system, okay, big, okay. Right. In this section, you have your big myelin sheet, okay, which is interrupted, okay. You have the axon that goes across. And then in this axon, all right, you need to have some opening, okay, which we'll do just like that, okay, little leg on top, okay, for the same, the other side, okay, this way, okay, and this opening will allow these molecules, these cations, right, etc., to go in, and for the ones that are inside, this system will allow them to go out. Okay, so this change in the process will determine the fact that the action potential can start. Okay, so right here at this intersection and the opening of this intersection are called nodes. Okay, nodes of Colombier. Okay, Colombier. You have this action potential that determines the transmission of this information onto the next neuron, of course, onto the next bundles of neurons. We're not ever talking about two neurons alone. Now, this is a very brief start, because we didn't start discussing what happens here. Here we observe what? The synaptic cleft, which will be the thing that the neurotransmitters will have to pass over or across in order for the content, for the information of these neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, etc., to be reabsorbed in the next neuron and possibly being avoided to go back. So to prevent the reuptake. The usual example that I always make is the SSRI, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that allow more serotonin, as it implies, to be flown through without the reabsorption. But this is something that we'll discuss some of the other weeks in this semester. So this is the very brief analysis in this section for module 2. There are a few more things that I would like to discuss, though. So this answers the very first part of the question, what is consciousness? At the very least, consciousness can be viewed as an electric or electrochemical magnetic process and mechanism that allows the brain to function. Okay? That's a very brief thing. Now, I do admit my bias. My field is neuroscience and psychology and medicine. So, of course, I tend to be biased toward the brain. Okay? Very similar argumentation, however, can be made for the entirety of the system, so the whole body, because after all, neurons are indeed cell bodies, and neurotransmission does not occur only on a cognitive level. We're not talking about just about brain function in terms of what we think. Everything involves an actual potential, whether I'm grabbing something, whether I'm seeing something, whether I'm digesting something, whichever interaction I have with the world, it will indeed involve this process right here. So it's a very basic building block. Now, let's continue, though, because I want to make sure that we don't spend too much time discussing the detail here, and we focus on what truly matters for now in a theoretical as well as practical sense. So let me erase this and go back to the basics. Now, as I mentioned multiple times, do not worry. We will cover the same aspect 1,000 times. So even if you're watching a video and you miss one part, don't you worry. As far as neuroscience, we will review these diagrams multiple times, so you will not miss much. But let's move on to the next section. All right, so last time we talked about pneuma, right? The Greek word that identifies the spirits, this ghost in the machine, right? So going from the action potential as a process, as a mechanism, which is electric, magnetic, and chemical, to the pneuma, it's, cognitively speaking, the best way to interact between what happens in the brain and what happens to the mind. So if we think about our existence or consciousness as a push, as a breath of fresh air, so to speak, a good way to look at it is how to see the inner fire, the inner sparkle moving inside our bodies, inside our souls, inside our mind. So from pneuma, right, which again, if you missed the first lecture, is in Latin, or in Latin Roman letters, transliterated as such, pneuma, pneumology, etc. From this, we'll see how the whole system interacts within itself. Now, what do we mean by system? We mean a sequence of things that are deeply interrelated, and they are interrelated in a way that matches everything we said so far, both from an empirical, materialistic perspective, as well as from a perspective of logical, cognitive, and theoretical matter. Now, let's stick a little bit longer to our nervous system here, because yet again, we need to repeat a few things. So with the nervous system, let's just spend a few minutes discussing how it's structured. And then from that, we will continue on to the philosophical debate. So we will resume this, but from the perspective of mind versus matter, we are on the matter now. Okay, we are talking about what can be observed. Okay, so we'll talk about the observation. Remember that we started from observation. We're still in the area. So observation also means to catalog, to accumulate data. So it's not enough to see something with our eyes, but it also is important to have a schema. So since we talked about action potential, we talked about this spirit, this breath of life, we talked about a sequence, we talked about neurons, let's talk about really quick about our nervous system, okay? Nervous system here. Now, if our nervous system here is a way to discuss what's happening in the body, the nervous system itself has to be understood in terms of schemas, okay? So the nervous system is divided, as you know, if you took any psychology class, into the central nervous system, okay, and the peripheral nervous system, okay? This is really Psych 101. So if this is too basic for you, feel free to skip. But this course is offered to anyone who is interested in the field. So we have to have some overlap. So central nervous system, just think about brain plus spinal cord, okay? And of course, all the connecting areas, so medulla oblongata, pons, etc. Peripheral nervous system itself subdivided, okay, into somatic and autonomic nervous systems, okay? I will skip the description and the definition for now. What I want you to focus on is on the autonomic nervous system, which in itself, finish with life, okay, is subdivided into, let me do this way, can I fit? Yes. Into sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so this is pretty much it for now, all right? And one thing that I always like to discuss in all my psychology classes is the importance of words. So I will not spend too much time on each of these terms for now, but just as an example that I make in every class, I want to focus on these last two, all right? So this answers the second part of the question. At first, the question was, how can we observe and define consciousness? And one of the first answers was, well, as long as you have something that is empirically valid, you can see, then you can assume at the very least that something exists in reality. And we did that by virtue of observing this little thing here, okay, our action potential. So at the very least, we can say that someone is alive, whether consciousness and wakeful state and being alive is the same thing. We'll discuss that in week 4 and week 5. But for now, this will be enough. The second part of the question was, okay, is consciousness something that exists or not? Is it binary or is it on a spectrum? And this is how we try to answer the second part. So let's delete the rest of the nervous system here, and let's stick to the autonomic nervous system and analyze these words, okay? Sympathetic and parasympathetic. This goes back to what we briefly analyzed last week. So you have S, Y, M, right, in both cases, right, as the central prefix, oxymoron. Right here, you have para, and then the common element between these two is the pathetic, right? All right. Okay, so let's start with the para first, because a good way to understand the difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system is simply to look at this one as a plus red light, green light, and this one as a minus red light. Pretend you are on a stop sign, there's a traffic light. So the sympathetic nervous system is the gas pedal, so to speak. It increases the process, amplifies the process, and the parasympathetic nervous system slows it down, calms it down, is the brake. This is oversimplifying what's going on because many processes involve both systems, but for the level of this lecture, let's just stick to plus and minus. Not in terms of electric charge, we're not talking about neurotransmission, but simply in terms of how you would define the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system. Another way that I usually define this, not etymologically accurate, but just for the sake of remembering it, is think of para as parachute, okay, which is the device that hopefully will slow you down if you're falling from the sky. So parasympathetic nervous system, brake pedal, sympathetic nervous system, gas pedal, okay? Now, let's talk about the term itself. Para is something that goes beyond, okay? In Greek, think of, for instance, parapsychology. If you are interested in a type of psychology that deals with transcendental elements, spirits, esotericism, which is to some extent what we're going to touch upon this semester, but it's something that goes beyond what's usually observed or assumed to be observed. The other term is paranormal, like paranormal activity that often is associated with the presence of spirits, of ghosts, of things that are more outside the realm of empirical science. So beyond, above and beyond, so to speak, passing beyond sympathetic. Now, the SYM you should remember, right? Because it's a very similar term as we already analyzed in Latin, the equivalent is CUM, right? In Latin. So with, together, okay? And then pathetic simply means related to feelings and emotions, to the Greek term pathos or pathos, okay? Now, this is interesting for me because that's where our analysis of the spectrum of consciousness is well described. Now, first and foremost, think about the spectrum of emotions of existence. In terms of consciousness, just think about how different time feels to you, whether you're spending it with a person you love as opposed to with a person you despise. In the first case, time is never enough, kind of flies. In the second case, you wish you were not there, and time is really, really slow. You can't wait for the time to be over. Hopefully, this lecture will fit into the first category, stuff you love, not stuff you don't love. So pathos as feeling, as emotion, but also much more than that, as consciousness in terms of a different type of awareness. An awareness that's filtered through different things, okay? A feeling the presence of the moment, okay? I would say it's not quite like being in the here and now, in the present moment, but feeling the environment in a different way. Think about how different you feel whether you enter a room, whether it's a person who you identify as a friend, as a nurturing person, and everything else feels calm and relaxed, nurturing, or the opposite situation where you enter a room where you know that that person is really, really arrogant and disrespectful and cold-hearted. And even if this person doesn't say anything, this person is just sitting right there in the corner, the whole feeling of the room changes for you. That's also the pathos. Or even the absence of the person, if you trust your intuition, your instinct, so to speak, although those two things are not the same, there are situations and places that immediately feel as if you are at home, and other places where you feel that there's something off here. That's also the pathos. Now, think about words, and I want to mention this to answer some of the questions that some of you asked me via email, more than question observations. And some of those questions had to do with how you define potential either threatening situation or disrespectful situation, or situation where you don't feel at ease, when you feel you're disrespected, where you feel that you don't belong, or you may feel as if you did not belong, okay? Now look at the word. Now, I always like to compare different languages here. So the equivalent of sympathetic, okay, in Latin, okay, interesting enough, is this, or SYM, okay? And again, in Greek letter, of course, we're talking about this, okay? Okay, in Cyrillic, we'll talk about this, okay? In Latin, okay, empathetic, it's this, So from pathos to passio in Latin, okay? Which, to go into English, you don't have to do much of a work. You just add an "n" here, okay? Here you have it, right? But look how different it is to be called pathetic versus passionate in English, okay? Or sympathetic as opposed to compassionate, okay? Of course, CU, or CO depends on the transliteration over the century. But while you can see the connection between being sympathetic and being compassionate, at the very least, they're both describe a connection with another human being, a proximity with another human being, okay? Being called pathetic versus passionate, it's quite different. It's almost on the opposite side of the spectrum, you could say. And this has to do with a variety of factors, some of which are just historical. Language does indeed develop and change in things, but also in the way certain things are blamed to be not appropriate. And there's an element of moralizing, maybe repressing emotion in our culture too, where if you're too emotional, that's not a good thing. You should, keep your emotion at bay. It's not appropriate. You should not, manifest yourself too much outwardly. Now, this is a course in psychology, so we will discuss how to define an emotional appropriate reaction, as opposed to be something that is effective and useful also to you, so that you can learn from your reaction. And an emotion that's strong, but doesn't really provide any added insight, okay? So this is to say that just talking about the nervous system and seeing how the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, these cannot be extrapolated from reality in a way that ignores how we are perceived in the world. And this is how I would like to continue the conversation today. All right, so this is something that I want to share with all of you, because you might wonder, what's the purpose of talking about neuroscience on one side and talking about words on the other side? Well, this is an essential part of this course. So going back to the basic, psychology of consciousness. How can we understand what the study of the mind is if we don't use words to describe it? So our duty is to make sure that the words we utilize are the closest to truth, the closest to what we can observe, either with our senses or with the technology, and whether this makes sense theoretically speaking. So let's go back to the whiteboard and see how we can make sense of this. Let's assume that we try to define consciousness and the psychology of it with a recipe, so to speak. So we need to have, I'm going to put it this way, solid scientific facts, okay? We need to talk about something that can be this area, observed, replicated, and verified, okay? I would say there's a fourth one, which will be very important in the context of medicine, and it's monitored over time, not over time as in longitudinal studies or meta-analysis, this time around, but much over time, because we're talking about a patient, for instance. So in the context of consciousness, this would also mean to monitor the state of affairs over time, overnight, for instance. Whether a person is in a comatose state or in a vegetative state or in a locked-in syndrome, for instance. So all this have to do with solid scientific facts, okay? Not opinions, not just theoretical knowledge, not philosophy, not spirituality at this stage, but just solid science, okay? This is not everything, however. On top of this, we have to have a proper epistemology, we could say, epistemology, okay, which will involve good theory, appropriate schematas, or schemas, whichever plural form of the Greek you want to use, And also, well described philosophy. Okay. On top of that, I would like to add experience. Okay. Experience. I will not add anything here as far as sub-descriptor, because experience, yet again, is connected to being an expert of what we experience. Being an expert is making an experience, okay? So at the very least, these are three ingredients that we should consider in the discussion of psychology of consciousness. So everything we said so far about neurotransmitters, action potential, neuroscience fits into this category. We can observe, okay? We can observe, we can replicate our studies, we can verify whether the study is accurate or not over time, and then we can monitor how that translates. It's another term that we will encounter multiple times, translational science or translational medicine, either or, okay? How this transfers into the bedside element, whether this is just knowledge that applies in the lab or whether this type of knowledge can be translated into the hospital, for instance, to the patient. On top of that, we have proper epistemology, because a lot of this class will be focused on anthropology, philosophy, sociology, the discussion, we will have the debate, and then personal experience. So, and that's precisely why words are so important. So let's take a step back here. Psychology of consciousness. Let me put it this way. One of the things that I notice very, very often on social media, on online debate, etc., is the need to prove the other person wrong. Now, this is really a wrong start in anything scientific. Not because we should not indulge into that. After all, we have to start from theories, and theories have to be proven either right or wrong, or at the very least misplaced for the area. So we should not shy away from the debate. The theory has to be solid, okay? We're talking about solid scientific fact plus proper epistemology, okay? Good theories, okay? But because there is something psychological about us that very often misses the point. So when you see online debates, very often there is the person A that attempts to prove the person B wrong, rather than having a conversation. Now, please pay attention to the detail here. I'm not advocating for correctness here, but I'm advocating for solid knowledge and willingness to share. This applies to science and also applies to any type of relationship. If you love someone, a good friend, say, or a family member you really, really value, you value their opinion, you value their heart, you value their mind, then you could avoid any type of discussion to quote unquote maintain the peace. And that might work for a little while until it stops working because you're presenting a fake version of yourself. And so I will not encourage you to do that. But at the same time, you don't want to unpack all your knowledge simply to provoke the other person. So it turns out to be finding this inner balance in your life where you can bring the best of both worlds. If you want to, so to speak, rock the boat, if you want to present a point of view, your point of view that is in disagreement with the point of view of someone else, you do that out of love because you want your love to blossom. You don't want to live in a relationship, whether we're talking about friendships, romantic relationship, professional relationship, family relationship, that's based on lying. You certainly don't want to provoke the person just for the sake of provoking, and that's unfortunately what happens in certain debates, that you just want to prove the person wrong. But you want to present the true part of yourself as well. So let's continue this discussion. And this is something that's also verified multiple times by empirical knowledge. There are plenty of scientific studies in the field of clinical psychology, social psychology, and cognitive psychology as well, where we analyze how much of what we perceive to be truth is actually truth. Now, in this last part of the lecture, I will not delve into each of the studies. We'll have plenty of time this semester, but I want to make these assumptions. So let's start with the concept of truth here, okay? Again, very first analysis, all right? Truth, okay? And then combine this concept, okay, with goodness, okay, and then beauty. Okay? Ooh, apologies. Beauty. Okay. Okay. So if we should strive for something, of course, on psychology of consciousness, I would say in life in general, we should strive to combine what is true what is good and what is beautiful. All right. I will go as far as saying that if any of this is missing, then you're missing the point. So let me start from the truth. Now, the truth is important because without truth, we will be living a lie. Now, it's not true, no pun intended, that not saying the truth constitutes a lie. It might just constitute an untruth or an unspoken truth. Example, if I were to say that if someone were to ask me, okay, are you wearing a black necktie today? Okay, the truth will be stating, I am not wearing a black necktie. But of course, you could also make the claim that there will be an added, more complete truth, saying that I am wearing a light purple, I guess, light purple, light pink necktie. Okay, that's the ultimate truth, so to speak. Not only it addresses the fact that my necktie is not black, but also added an added truth. So truth in this sense is not black and white, no pun intended, but it adds something more. A half truth or not saying the full truth would be something as stating, I am not wearing a black necktie. Okay? If someone were to be specific, and I guess assume that this is, let's say, lilac as a color. If someone were to ask me, are you wearing a lilac necktie? Okay, then I will have to answer with yes. Okay. But if my answer is evading the question, as in, well, I'm not wearing a black one, that is not necessarily lying to the person, okay, but it's also not telling the truth. So this is an advice for you. Sometimes you will not be able to tell the full truth to a person for a variety of reasons. You might not tell the truth because you don't know what the truth is, because you don't dare to tell what the truth is, or because you might be confused inside. Now, at the very least, if you cannot tell the truth, please, please, please avoid telling a lie. It's always better not to say anything rather than lying. And this is something that is so important, whether you are in physical, real relationships or taking a quiz, because telling a lie, first of all, is something that will eat you alive eventually. Okay? But also, telling a lie is equivalent to postponing the truth, postponing the fact that you will have to face the truth at some point in your life. I want to give an example of that. If a person tells you that they love you, and let's assume it's a relationship, and it's a relationship where you don't feel connected anymore, you feel that that's not for you, okay? And even this person does not verbalize that outwardly, but a person asks you, do you love me? And you, for a variety of reasons, say, yes, I do love you, despite the fact that you're not quite sure. That is in between telling a lie and in between not telling the full truth. So if you said, yes, I do love you, and you know inside that this is not a truth, that should be viewed as a lie. Okay? But then you might be not sure because there are a lot of emotions that happens inside of you. You don't want to break their hearts because after all, you care for this other person, but maybe you don't care enough to be in love with them, to be in a romantic relationship with them. Or maybe you're confused, you don't know what you want in life. So my advice for you will be, do your best with the knowledge you have at that point. Try to investigate what your heart is telling you. If you cannot say that you love the person, do not say it. Suspend the judgment. And the person is pressuring you, and they might be, right in doing that because they want to have some sort of knowledge. That at the very least, you need to ask for clarification from yourself. So say, I'm not sure. It's better to not tell a lie. And that's a point. And again, this is not to point a finger to the fact that there's always a black and white situation. You might be confused, you don't know. And this applies also to a person that might be in a decade-long relationship, long-lasting, healthy marriages. Emotions go up and down, they flow. We cannot rely only on our emotions. We have to rely on a variety of things to make sense of life. But this is what we mean by truth. What is truth? This is one of the most important things in life. Again, you might not know the truth, but at the very least, avoid telling a lie. Examples, not in relationship, but in, mathematics. You know that 1 + 1 = 2. We're not talking about the binary system now. 1 + 1 = 2. But let's assume that you're not quite sure whether it's 2 or 2.5, but you're sure that it's not 4. Don't write down 4. Okay? So we should aim for what is true as much as we can. So how does that translate into psychology of consciousness? Well, we don't know what else this machine does. We don't know what else neurotransmitters do, but at the very least, we can replicate those studies in order to prove the existence of neurotransmitters of actual potential, et cetera, et cetera. So we strive for the truth. The next one here, what is good? Now, this is much more complicated because, of course, goodness, it's a term that in Indo-European linguistics is connected to a variety of things. Well, the most important one of which is, of course, from good to God. Okay? So, and of course, nothing happens randomly in linguistics. It's not by chance that the two terms are connected. They do indeed mean the same thing. And theological consideration aside from now, we should strive toward God because we should strive toward good, to what is good. Now, at this point in our lecture, we suspend the judgment. We're not talking about that specific God, that specific spirituality, that specific mode of existence, that specific religion, that specific divine being or divine beings in the plural form. But this is very, very important. In psychology of consciousness, this is important because regardless if all your truth, all your data are correct, the application of that data in the context of relationship, social context, life in general, will still assume a direction that's given by this element, okay? So if this is the realm of science, as in, let's say, techne, for instance, okay, technology, studies, etc., okay, this one will be the science as in phronesis, okay, phronesis. So you could say morality, you could say ethics, okay, you could say prudence, etc., okay, okay. The direction, for instance, let's assume that stimulating, this part of the brain will make the person angry, okay? With that type of knowledge, what should we do is the realm of goodness, okay? The fact that we know what makes us angry should inform our behavior so that we don't make ourselves more angry and we don't project this angry outburst onto others. So that's a choice that's predicated on this. Whether morality and ethics is something that changes over time, whether it's predicated on science or not, we'll see, but it's a second element. Third element, beauty. what is beautiful. Now, you might wonder, why on earth should we talk about what is beautiful in a scientific course, assuming that, as we briefly discussed last week, psychology is a scientific field. And in this sense, I simply mean in the context of the two previous considerations we made. What is beautiful? Well, beautiful is connected to the third term, okay, that we discussed last week. So definitely, for instance, interesting enough, episteme. Okay. Now you wonder, wait a second, didn't you just say that episteme has to do with science, with truth, with data? Yes, absolutely. But there's beauty in science, there's beauty in mathematics, there's an aesthetic beauty. I'm not talking just about a figurative sense, okay, as if that was not good enough. But I'm talking about the fact that things are meant to be a certain way because it's a way that represents the truth, the good, and the beautiful. There's beauty in mathematics, there's beauty in structure, there's beauty in the scientific method, there are beauty in structures, there's beauty in fractals, there's beauty in symbols, okay? What is beautiful, okay? Now, in connection to that, I also want to mention the term kalos in Greek. I will use our letters, okay? Kalos, okay? Kalos, which is the term that we utilize for calligraphy, okay? Calligraphy as in good script. A script that is beautiful, aesthetically speaking, is good because it achieves the purpose of being read and written, and it's true because it represents what I am trying to say. So calligraphy, kalos, beauty, okay? And this is connected to the Latin term, I will write B-O-N, us, bonum, etc., okay? Okay, and of course, bellum, bellus. Okay, now, all these three terms are connected. Now, of course, bellum in this sense could also mean war. It's a separate etymology. Think of belligerent in English. Okay, but the Latin bellum and the Italian bello, it's a contraction of bonus, benulus. Okay, the good, the truth, and the beautiful, all packed in ones. There's three categories that are all packed in ones. So. Now let's go back from beauty to goodness and to truth. I mentioned that there's an aesthetic beauty, okay, what we perceive to be good. And this is fundamental. So what do we mean by beautiful? Something that is perceived as such. So let's go back here, okay, and talk about our senses, right? So we started from the broadest possible perspective of neuroscience, and we're going to delve deeper and deeper into our experience, right? So we'll see what we mean by that. I'm excited about this. So we started from what is beautiful, okay? Beautiful. Okay. Full of beauty, okay? And the connection is with our experience, okay? So if you combine our experience of or with what is beautiful, what you have is aesthetics. Aesthetics. What are aesthetics? Aesthetic is the field of perception, okay? Perception. If you are an artist, a musician, a performer, okay, you need to know, you need to feel, you need to understand how important aesthetics are. Okay? Now, whether these two terms are equivalent, synonyms or not, they are for the sake of this conversation. Okay, so aesthetic as perceiving something. What is perception? Perception is perception. Okay? So something we grasp, we grab, we understand, okay? To grab, metaphorically speaking, okay? To conceptualize, to understand, okay? Okay, caption. And then the per, okay, means for. if you are familiar with linguistics, okay, you might have heard of the Grimm brothers, right? Grimm, okay. One of their main contribution, besides their wonderful fairy tales and the folklore studies, is the contribution to linguistics, especially the concept of, I'll write up here, Lautverschiebung, which simply means the change of vowels and consonant of spelling, of pronunciation, of phonetics over time. So for in English could be phonetically spelled as P-H-O-R, okay? P-H-O, okay? P-H-E-R, and then P-H becomes P, okay? Perception, so that per in Latin becomes for in English. So a conception, understanding aimed at something, with a direction, with a purpose, with a meaning. That's what we mean by aesthetics. So in other words, you don't just perceive things for what they are, but what they are manifests itself into your own perception. You create ideas that fit into reality. This is connected to what we said last week, okay? We don't perceive the world just as facts, but as patterns, as symbols, right? As archetypes. For instance, if I'm saying, is this dry erase marker beautiful or not? Is it good or not? Well, we might disagree with the external layers, okay? In terms of the layout, the way it was built, we might disagree on the shape, the angle, the choice of colors, the choice of the percentage and structure of the overall appearance of the item. But we can agree on the fact that this might or might not be good for its purpose, okay? Now, this specifically, a lot because it has a chisel ending, right? So it allows me to do small lines or more thick lines. That's why this is so good to do kind of Gothic letterings and stuff like that, because it's really done with a, good chisel ending. So I would consider this wonderfully beautiful for the sake of the class. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. We see things with a higher purpose. And in psychology, this is what you should aim at. You should aim for the truth, the good and the beautiful in everything you do. And that's how you develop consciousness, a higher level of consciousness. You remove yourself from the limits and limitation of your single self, and you expand that into the world. Now, we will talk more about that in detail, but think of this in connection to what we just said before. You're entering a conversation with another human being. You have all your neural underpinnings, all your action potential, all your neurons firing up. You are aware of the circumstances, the noise, the loudness, the tone and color of the voice of the person. Hopefully, you will be aware also of the content, but very, very often, studies have indicated that multiple times, everything else makes more sense than the content. We might be triggered in a positive or a negative way, not so much about the content of what we discussed, but about everything else, about this meta-linguistic analysis. You don't need a neuroscientist to tell you that 80 or 85, depending which study you quote, some study even claim that up to 97% of all communication is nonverbal. You don't need a neuroscientist to tell you that. It's pretty intuitive. But this is even more important where we get upset, not about the very claim that a person is making, but about all the other noise-making features of what's going on. And this is really an important thing to keep in mind if you enter any type of debate. We will resume this in week 7, week 8. You need to use all of this to develop a higher, enhanced sense of aesthetics. So, in a schema perspective here, I will add what this means in therapeutic, in a therapeutic sense and from a clinical perspective. So you need to refine your soul, so to speak, your sense of self. Context. let's just call it interaction, okay? Interaction with another human being. So the first thing is the context, okay? The context or environment, okay? Example, you need to make stillness in your heart to focus, okay? It's hard to listen to a person in a loud environment. You're going to, I don't know, a Swedish black metal concert. I love that stuff. But if you go to that concert, it's hard to understand if a person is, you know, reciting Robert Frost in your ears. There's too much noise, too much stimulation. Okay, audio sensory stimulation. The same thing is if you are online and your perceptual modality is bombarded constantly with shapes and figures and colors and noises, it's hard to focus on the small print because you're overstimulated. So you need to selectively separate yourself from too much noise. Okay? So from the conscious environment, you try to minimize. You focus on the person. Okay, and yet again, big asterisk here, it's really becoming more and more difficult to do that because our sense of self, again, consciousness has the ability to detect a signal, select our attentive mechanism, and isolate it from the rest. This in itself becomes already negatively influenced by whatever category we put the person in. So the person is no longer themselves, but the person becomes, I don't know, becomes one of us versus, in juxtaposition, opposition, one of them, okay? And this applies to what? To politics, to religion, or lack thereof, to social norms, to morals or moralizing aspects, to the news, all the way to pretty much whichever category of social existence you pick. Please do focus on the person, not on the part or the party, not on the group, not on the schemas that you or society itself project upon a person. We need to interact heart to heart, mind to mind, okay? This is always something that I say to my patients. So you hear me saying this 1,000 times, bear with me. If you cannot make sense of reality, you are allowed to borrow someone else's mind or borrow someone else's heart. Borrowing someone else's mind, figuratively speaking, simply means to try to understand the thing you're experiencing from a separated, more objective, if I may use this term, perspective. Okay? You might be too involved in the situation to see the situation in an accurate way. So you borrow someone else's mind. I cannot make sense of this. Can you help me out with that? Borrowing someone else's mind can also be something very practical. Let's say, I don't know how to solve this equation. Could you help me? Much more important, I would say, simply because we don't think of it, is borrowing someone else's heart. When our emotions are too strong, they tend to mislead us. Again, this is not choosing between thoughts and emotion, okay? We're not doing this. We're not claiming that a rationalistic, intellectualistic thought is superior to heartfelt emotion. But we cannot rely on either or alone. We're trying to bring these two things together. But in general, I will admit that my bias toward the thought overrides my bias toward emotion for the simple reason that in general, we are more aware of our thoughts because the thoughts at the very least can be explained, can be written out, than we are aware of our emotions, okay? And that's precisely that when we need to focus on the person, we focus not on the person themselves, but on what they are saying, okay? Thought, but of course, because we cannot see another person's thought, I'm being a psychologist and working in neuroscience for many years, I cannot still read anybody's mind, just ask my wife. So I cannot read her mind for sure, or my kids. But the thought as express, so thought as expression, okay? Expression. So what is pressed, pushed out of their mind, out of their heart, okay? In other words, ask. If you want your consciousness to increase, if you want your heart to develop, if you want your mind to expand, you need to ask. You cannot assume things. A lot of problems in psychology happen due to this very fact. We do not ask. Example, think about boundaries, okay? Let's assume that you live in an apartment with a roommate with whom you've been living for the last 2 years or something. And overall, things work quite well. There's one thing that always bothered you. I don't know, they never put the dishes away. They never rinse the dishes. They never wash the dishes. They just pile the dishes in the sink. This person is wonderful on all accounts. You have the exact same mentality. You vote for the same political party. You have exactly the same worldview. So you might think, well, I'm not going to bother that for the sake of peace. It's a small thing. I agree with this person on every other area in my life. Who cares if they're not quite the way I like it? But eventually this thing starts to consume you, starts to eat you alive from within. And every day, every morning, when you wake up, you have that reminder of the fact that you're so triggered by it. And at this point, you might be internally split because you might be feeling guilty. I shouldn't feel that way because they're so kind. And I said them a few times, it's okay. But the point is that you might never actually express how you feel. Okay? You might never express how you think about that. In other words, you might have said in past, you know, we should really do the dishes or something, but you never actually meant it, okay? And then one day you just explode, and this person will be completely, flabbergasted about your behavior because to them this fell out of the blue. And they might overreact to the point of proving you right, and you don't want to be proven right. They might say things like, you're so obnoxious about that. Who cares? We've been doing this for 2 years. You never said anything. What's wrong with you? The point is that you never said that anything. So when we set boundaries, we need to be open. We need to be transparent. We need to focus on expressing ourselves. We cannot expect the other person to read our minds, okay? We cannot expect ourselves to read their minds. And more important, we cannot expect us and then to have the exact same perspective on every single item. In other words, you might be triggered about the dishes, but you might be triggering that person in a variety of other ways upon which the person never uttered a word. So the best way to solve a problem is, guess what? To observe, identify, categorize, and then solve the problem, okay? That's why it's so important to narrow things down to the expression itself. For instance, this is extremely important when we talk about things such as identity, group, gender, politics, sexuality, future, even taxes, degrees, titles, names, pretty much everything. We should focus on what the person has to say, not on the way the person presents themselves, not on what group we attribute them to be. Just focus on the thought, debate the argument, debate the person, or even better, rather than think of it as a debate, think of it as an interaction, as a conversation, as a dialogue. Dialogue is the key. That's what we go back here. So this lecture is a little longer, but I have a lot of things to say, so you can bear with me, all right? Dialogue is what I wish upon you. Dialogue. What is a dialogue? Is what we discussed last week, the logos, right? The verb, the verbum, okay? It's a metaphysical entity, this truth, this beautiful, okay? This goodness that is shared by two people, okay? The conversation, the study, the exploration between two people, between two souls, between two states of consciousness. And this is the beauty, the truth, and the goodness of what we're trying to learn here. So in conclusion, I want to add one more thing here. Psychological consciousness studies what's here to last, all right? Scientific studies are there to indicate how things manifest themselves right here, right now, and hopefully will not change over time. That's why we have multiple studies that are built upon the previous one. That's why we have this replication issue. But if you find this truth, the good and the beautiful, this will not change. And this is something that's very nurturing, it's very healing, okay? So this is, I promise, the very last part for this lecture. What is healing is the fact that there are things that are unchangeable, okay? In other words, that are perennial, to quote the philosophical term from last week. They are universal, and brace yourself, eternal, okay? So there is a difference between disagreeing and avoiding the dialogue for the sake of maintaining peace. Far too often you hear claims as in, everything is good as long as it's good for you. Now, notice that this feels very good at first, okay? Anything is good as long as it's quote unquote good for you, which is quite interesting from a linguistic perspective, because we use in English the term good for you to define, for instance, locally sourced organic food, right? It's good for you, right? But this also hides a big lie. The fact that everything that is good for you is entirely subjective. Okay? Okay? Which goes against this, especially, where is it? This. Okay? And it's a very slippery slope. I'll give you an example. I'm gonna quote my kids here. Okay? So let's assume that one of my kids, I'm not gonna mention any names so they're not getting mad at me. One of my kids will say, I want something sweet, okay? And I might say, well, you have an option here. There is one piece of cake. There's an apple there. I would hope they will pick the apple, but at the same time, the cake was freshly baked by my wife, who's a wonderful cook. And so I said, well, you know, it's not a bad choice. Except that my son says, you know what? I want 3 pieces of cakes instead of 1. And I might say, well, no, you can only have 1. Now, if I'm applying this knowledge, my son will be entirely correct in stating, no, I know what's good for me, and I can claim that 3 pieces are better than 1. At the end of the day, mathematically speaking, 3 is superior to 1. Nobody can argue against that, right? So 3 pieces are superior to 1 piece, okay? So by all accounts, theoretically, rationally, logically, mathematically, my child will be correct. Not only that, but if he used himself as the only parameter according to which to establish the truth, even in the context, he will be correct. I know myself because I am myself. Don't you tell me what is good for me. I know that 3 pieces are better than 1. Now, this is where the suspension of judgment is so useful in science. I know as a fact, as a universal, eternal, perennial, unchangeable fact, that a person's, my size, age, experience, body structure, whichever term you want to use, will eat 3 pieces of my wife's cake, he will be nauseous and most likely he will throw up, okay? Now, yes, I'm not him, I'm beyond his experience, I'm not inside his body, but I'm not saying that to control him, to moralize him, to make fun of him, to belittle him, even though he might actually feel all these things. I love him So much so to go against the subjective perception, which in this specific case also deprived of enough years of experience to state that this is actually not true. Okay. Another example, also with a cake, will be to say to someone who might suffer with diabetes mellitus that they could just eat any piece of cake they wanted to, despite the fact that it's scientific knowledge there to demonstrate that there are other strategies that might be more positive. Okay? So this is to say that you need to find a balance between these two poles. Yes, you are an expert because you're making the experience, but always keep in mind that the way you experience things, it's also predicated upon the fact that you are viewing the world from your perspective. So it should not become us versus them, or me as an individual versus the group. It should be an integration of things. And to conclude, this is something I'd like you to bring home from this conversation. In a psychology of consciousness class, we will delve deep into what consciousness means. But in our attempt to find this truth, this beautiful and this good, then we should also take people at face value, not necessarily upon the presentation, okay, because everybody has a bad day from time to time, bad hair day, but we should base our reaction on what they are actually stating, saying, and manifesting. We should never assume that there is a secret agenda or they're telling us half-truth. And you know, this is counterintuitive at first because we might be hurt, we might be burned, we might have been heartbroken in the past. So we venture into the world with a suspiciousness, with a cynical self that always expects the worst. In clinical psychology, that will be constituting a cognitive distortion, always expecting the worst, okay? Catastrophizing. But here's the thing. If a person says, for instance, that, I want to give you this example to conclude. Let's assume that you're studying this course, all right? And you're taking a quiz, or you're working on your final paper. And I don't know, of 20 questions, you only got, I don't know, 11 right above the midline. Okay? And you're crushed by it because you thought you studied enough. And then you come to me, all right? And you got to three persons. First, you talk to me, then you talk to a friend, and then you talk to, well, let's say, a classmate, right? We all say the same thing, okay? Our assessment was that you probably did not study enough, but if you study, you can perform better. The first thing here to do is separating the context and the thought from the person. If I'm saying to you, you need to study more, I'm not calling you any sort of name that might flow into your brain at this point, okay? Some of which might contain dumb or unintelligent or silly or stupid. I'm not calling any of these names. I'm simply stating that it's a question of practice, and study. Okay? Your friends, your classmates will say the same thing. I'm sorry that happened to you. If you study more, it might be better, okay? But they might package in a different way. Maybe a good friend of yours might say, you're very intelligent. I'm sure that you can do better next time, okay? But even so, you might have this tendency of, I don't know, ignoring these things. You might say, in my case, well, you're just saying that because that's what you say to every student. So you don't really see me as a person. You see just me as a number, okay? All the students you teach. So your evaluation doesn't really mean anything to me. To a friend, you might say, well, you just want to be nice because you're my friend, but you don't really know what's going on. I'm just dumb. And on and on and on. So for each of the category, use an excuse. You put people in category, in groups, without actually listening to them. You're just saying that because you're a professor, or in my case, you're just saying that because you're a psychologist, you just say that because you're a friend. But you cannot assume that they're lying to you or they're so ignorant not to know the truth. After all, I mentioned this in multiple cases. If you value someone's heart or someone's mind, it means you value the way they interpret the world. Otherwise, why bother? Why would you be a friend with someone who's not a good person, who doesn't see the truth, the beautiful, and the good in you? Why wouldn't you trust a person that teaches you the class if you know already that the way they interpret the word is completely false? Okay. Now, there might be a situation where people might say things that are not quite aligned with our expectations. So this is the very last thing of this example. This is especially true in romantic relationships. You might say, well, my partner doesn't really get what I want. Okay. Our love language, to quote a term that's very often found in social media, our love language is so different. Okay. I love physical attention, and they love more intellectual connection. I love when I don't know, they clean up the house, where they fix things in my car. I love when they surprise me and buy me dinner or something like that. And the other person loves when we go to the movies together, we debate the movie we just watched, or when we exchange opinions about a post on social media or read a book. Okay. But the point is that it's completely irrelevant, or definitely not as relevant as you might think, whether you disagree on this. Okay. As long as you make your needs manifested, okay, you express what you like to the other person, and then you cannot expect the person to be a different human being altogether. So let's assume that I am the kind of person that would prefer, I don't know, more intellectual manifestation of love. My love language is up here and not so much down here, okay? Or even below. And my partner would tell me, in my case, my wife will say, how about we read this book together? And I immediately disregard that as, well, you don't really mean that. You don't really like to read books. You don't really like, neuroscience to begin with. You just there to please me. But guess what? Yes, that's what love is about. Also understanding what the other person's needs are, and within the limits of reality, what is proper and what is good, okay? Doing that, you don't have to become necessarily the other person, but your willingness to reach another person's heart is in itself proof of the truth, the good, and the beautiful. The same thing as smiling at another person, okay? Now, in this culture, in this country, we might have this tendency to hide our emotions. So the usual example I give all the time is, if you're going to buy groceries and the cashier will ask you, how are you doing, sir, today? And if you start saying, how bad your day is, they might be a little, afraid of you and say, what's going on? So some of that is fake, it's true. But if you approach life with a smile, life will smile back at you, even though you might not feel necessarily that way. So as long as you manifest that outwardly, you want to reach out to the other person, you always have to gain that. So as cheesy as this may sound, in order to understand our consciousness, love should be the primary light that illuminates us. But love is also a complicated matter. And just as this, okay, you need to understand the love that actually embellishes you, nurtures you, removes the obstacle for you from other types of love that might be very sweet at first, but it also might mask what's going on. They might be patching the problem or making the problem even worse, just as sweet does. All right, so that would be it for this lecture. Let me just take a quick look at the quiz to make sure that I mention everything to you. All right. And we shall continue next time. I hope you enjoyed week number 2. We will continue with the chapter. And as I mentioned multiple times, the book should only be used as a guide. Some of you asked me, should I read the whole book all at once? I usually advise against that because it can be overwhelming. So I will mention from time to time the type of conversation that you need to remember as far as the class goes. But thank you very much for your attention for this very long lecture today with all different elements. And I hope I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.